The strangest thing about that Christmas night was not how quickly the laughter broke out in a room full of relatives. It was the fact that my father, standing in front of a Christmas tree still glowing with lights and plates of cookies no one had even touched yet, raised his wine glass as if he were announcing something perfectly normal and said that I needed to be taught some manners again. My name is Allison Harper. I am 31 years old. And that night, in front of more than 30 relatives, my father declared that just because I dared to ask about the promise my grandmother had made before she died, I would be ordered upstairs and told to stay in my room until morning like a misbehaving child. The whole room burst into laughter. Some people lowered their heads, hiding their smiles behind their wine glasses. Some looked at me with pity. And my mother just sat there, her hands clenched tightly on her knees, as if she had been sitting inside that silence her entire life. My face burned. But the most painful part was not the humiliation. It was realizing that no one in that room thought it was wrong. I looked at my father, gave him the faintest smile, and said, "All right, Dad. Let's wait until tomorrow." The next morning, when he opened my bedroom door with that smug look on his face, the bed had been neatly made, the closet was empty, and I was gone. At that exact moment, the doorbell rang. On the porch stood an elderly lawyer, holding a dark brown document box, his face pale, as if he were carrying something that could make the entire Harper family never look at one another the same way again. If my story is touching something in you right now, stay with me until the end. And if you'd like, subscribe so you don't miss stories like this, and tell me where you're listening from, because to understand why my father was so afraid of that question, I have to take you back a few months earlier, to the day my grandmother died, and the first secret began to surface. I do not know whether people always sense a real loss before it happens, but the morning my mother called me, I had been awake since very early, even though I had worked until nearly midnight the night before. The drawings for a brick house built in the 1920s were still spread open on my desk. My pencil lay tilted beside a cup of cold tea, and outside the window of my small apartment, the Charleston sky was a soft shade of gray. When my phone vibrated, my heart sank before I even heard my mother's voice. "It's Grandma," my mother said, her voice so thin it sounded as if one word spoken too loudly might make it shatter. "Allison? She's gone." I sat still for a few seconds, my hand resting on the edge of the desk, my eyes fixed on an unfinished pencil line in the drawing. Some sentences are so simple that once you hear them, the whole room seems to change shape. I did not cry right away. I just felt every sound around me pull farther away, as if someone had quietly closed a glass door between me and the rest of the world. I drove to the hospital in silence, remembering that they had moved her there the night before, when her breathing became too shallow. I did not turn on the radio. I did not call anyone back. There was only the soft patter of drizzle against the windshield and the steady sweep of the wipers, like the rhythm of someone trying to keep breathing evenly. I thought about my grandmother's hands. They were always warm, even after old age had made her fingers thin and the blue veins stand out beneath her skin. She was the only person in my family who had ever picked up my old sketches carefully, studied them for a long moment, and then spoken with a kind of respect that made it seem as though what I created truly mattered. My father had never been like that. To him, my work was just a more politely worded version of failure. He called my work restoring historic interiors, cleaning up memories for rich people's houses. Whenever he said that, my brother Connor would usually just lower his head and let out a faint laugh, the kind of laugh that told everyone exactly where he stood without his having to say a word. He was exactly the kind of man my father had always wanted beside him. Tall, composed, precise in the way he spoke, dressed in well-fitted suits, and working as an attorney at a prestigious firm in Atlanta, the kind of man who never hesitated to use legal language when family power was at stake. Everything about him was polished, proper, easy to show off to relatives. And me, in my father's eyes, I was always the extra piece in a picture he did not want. But my grandmother, Margaret Allison Harper, did not look at me that way. She never had. The last time I saw her was 4 days before she died. That afternoon, she was sitting in the greenhouse behind the garden, beside the pots of gardenias and the rosemary she had cared for with her own hands for years. The late sunlight slanted across the glass, making her silver hair glow with a gentle softness. I remember saying, trying to keep my voice light, "If you're tired, Grandma, you shouldn't stay out here too long." She smiled, that small but steady smile of hers. "Plants don't tire me out, people do." I pulled out a chair and sat down beside her. She placed her hand over mine and gave it the gentlest squeeze, but it was enough for me to know she was trying to pass something on to me that was bigger than words. Then she looked straight at me and said quietly, each word clear, "When I'm gone, do not believe the first thing they tell you." I froze. "Who is they, Grandma?" She did not answer right away. She turned and looked out into the garden, where a few climbing roses clung quietly to the old wooden trellis. "You'll know," she said. "Just remember that I knew exactly what I was doing." At that moment, I wanted to ask more, but she just gently stroked the back of my hand, as if she had already said enough, and the rest was a road I would have to walk on my own. I sat with her for almost another hour. We did not talk much. We just listened to the ceiling fan turning slowly above us, the scent of damp soil and lemon leaves drifting through the air, and the strange stillness of someone who seemed to have finished preparing for what she was about to leave behind. At the funeral, my father stood at the front of the church, wearing that perfectly solemn expression he always used on occasions when he needed to be seen as a model man. His eulogy was beautiful, polished, and proper enough that if I had not known who he really was, I might have thought he was a devoted son. He spoke about family tradition, about honor, about how the legacy would continue in the right hands. He mentioned Connor's name 3 times with pride he did not even try to hide. He thanked my mother in one very short sentence. But my name did not appear even once, as if I had never existed in the memory of the woman now lying in that coffin covered in white flowers. I stood in the third pew, my hands ice cold, even though I was gripping them tightly together. Not because I was surprised. Some wounds repeat so many times that eventually they stop shocking you. They just make you tired. But when the service ended, as people slowly began filing out of the pews, an older man I had never seen before stepped in front of me. Tall, thin, dressed with the quiet formality of someone used to handling other people's private affairs. Behind his narrow glasses, his eyes were strangely calm. He held out his hand. I took it on instinct. He held my hand just long enough to make me look straight at him. "Your grandmother asked me not to lose sight of you," he said quietly, as if he were leaving me a message rather than starting a conversation. Later, I would understand why he said no more. He had been told not to push me, only to make sure I knew where the door was when I was finally ready to open it. I stood still for a few seconds after the man walked away, as if his words had left something with real weight in the palm of my hand. When I stepped out onto the church stairs, my father was talking to 2 old family friends in that familiar, steady voice of his, while Connor stood beside him, one hand in his coat pocket, his head tipped slightly as he listened, as if every place in this life had always been prepared for him. My mother stood not far away, lips pressed tight, her eyes red but no longer crying. None of the 3 of them looked in my direction. Or if they did, it was the way it had always been, looking straight through me. That afternoon, I went back to the family house not because I wanted to stay there, but because something strange inside me would not settle, something I could not quite name, as if my grandmother had still left some door slightly open, and all I had to do was stay calm enough to find it. The house was so large and so quiet that I could hear the sound of my heels against the wooden hallway floor. The white funeral flowers had already been arranged in the living room, and the sweet scent of lilies was almost suffocating. From my father's study came the sound of him talking on the phone, broken words drifting through the half-closed door, procedures, paperwork, asset management. I walked past without stopping, only feeling my grandmother's words in the greenhouse rise close to me again. "Do not believe the first thing they tell you." My old room was at the end of the upstairs hallway, still almost untouched from years ago. The white wooden bed, the window looking out over the line of oak trees, the low bookshelf in the corner. All of it carried the feeling of a time that had been left behind, but had never truly disappeared. A thin layer of dust rested on the writing desk by the window, and the moment I reached out and touched the wood, I remembered it at once. My grandmother had given it to me when I was 16. She had once said, "A girl should have a place to keep the things other people are not patient enough to understand." I pulled out the chair and sat down without thinking. My fingers traced the underside of the largest drawer, then stopped at a tiny raised spot inside the wood. My heart began pounding hard. I pressed it. A soft click sounded, almost too quiet to hear if the room had not been so still. Behind the drawer, a small hidden compartment opened, just big enough to hold one envelope, a few folded pages, and an old brass key with no label attached. I picked up the envelope first. The handwriting on the front was my grandmother's, shakier than it used to be but still perfectly neat. For Allison. Just those 2 words were enough to make my eyes sting. I opened it very slowly. Inside, she had written briefly, clearly, with no extra flourishes, as if she knew I would have to read it, while my heart was in no state to endure even one more ounce of uncertainty. She said my father would try to control everything. She warned me not to show this letter to my mother, and not to let Connor know about it either. She wrote that the original was not in the house, that what she had left here was only enough for me to understand that I had not imagined any of it. And when the time came, a man named Samuel Pierce would know what to do. I laid the letter on my lap, then opened the remaining pages. They were photocopies from a legal file, but incomplete, as if someone had intentionally left just enough to hint at the truth without allowing me to see the whole of it yet. On one page I saw my name clearly. On another was the phrase, "Sole Residential Beneficiary." An address appeared near the top, Sullivan's Island. I had not even finished making sense of that when my eyes stopped on a sentence that had been carefully underlined. "Not because she is the easiest to love, but because she is the one who knows how to keep a home alive." I sat motionless for a long time with that page in my hand. Not because I understood everything, but because I did not. Still, one thing began rising inside me with slow certainty, like a line of light slipping through the crack of a closed door. My grandmother had not only left behind money or property, she had made a choice. And that choice was not based on who spoke more smoothly, who made more money, or who looked more like the ideal family picture. It was based on who she believed truly knew how to keep a home alive. I knew right then that that alone would be something my father would never forgive. After that evening, I left the family house earlier than I had planned. I did not tell anyone when I was leaving, and I did not leave a note. Some houses, once the silence inside them starts to mean something, make you realize that you cannot stay too long if you still want to hear your own thoughts clearly. I drove back to my apartment in Charleston, hung my coat behind the door, placed the brass key and the copied pages into my desk drawer, and went to work the next morning, as if nothing had changed. The only difference was that from that moment on, nothing inside me was still the way it had been before. Work had always been the place I disappeared into whenever life outside grew too loud. I picked up extra hours at the studio, took on tasks that could easily have waited until the following week, stood for hours inside an old house under restoration, choosing wood tones for a door frame, measuring every trim line again, discussing with the painters how to preserve the old patina while still making the room breathe like a place where people actually lived. People often think my job is just making old things look beautiful again. In truth, most of the time, I'm simply trying to listen closely enough to know what deserves to be kept and what has finally reached the point where it needs to be taken down from the wall. 3 weeks passed that way. I did not call Samuel Pierce. I did not mention the letter to my mother or to anyone else. But almost every morning, I opened the drawer, looked at the envelope in my grandmother's handwriting, then closed it again. Not because I did not trust her, but because I knew that once I touched the truth, I would never be able to pretend to live the same life again. That Monday afternoon, I was sitting at my desk, revising design documents for a townhouse built in 1911, when my computer chimed with a new email. I was about to ignore it, because the revised submission was due by the end of the day, and I did not have the headspace for anything else. But the subject line flashed across the screen just enough to make my hand stop in midair. Emergency motion trust adjustment strategy. I stared at those words for a few seconds. The sender was Connor. I was not the intended recipient. It was obviously a forwarded message sent by mistake, or a misdirected email, or some tiny slip from someone who had grown too used to believing that everything would always stay under control. I opened it. The email chain was longer than I expected. There were back-and-forth exchanges between Connor and my father going back several days, the tone efficient, cold, completely professional. They were discussing a petition to modify the trust. They talked about strategy, about the likelihood of court approval, about how to present the current beneficiary as not competent enough to receive the assets. I read line after line, feeling the chill spread very slowly from the back of my neck down my spine. My father described me as financially unstable. Connor added that I was easily influenced by emotion and not suited to manage legacy-based assets. One section went even further, saying that my profession did not reflect long-term financial judgment, that I tended to cling to sentimental value instead of making practical decisions. Every sentence sounded like legal language, but underneath that polished language I could still hear my father's familiar voice very clearly. The voice of a man who had spent years calling everything I loved small, unimportant, impractical. Then I scrolled to the last line in one of Connor's emails. She won't push back. My sister still wants to be loved too much to fight back. I do not know how long I sat there after reading that sentence. Some pain does not come like a knife. It comes like a hand placed exactly on an old bruise, light enough that no one else would notice, precise enough that you know the other person understands exactly where you have been hurt before. If my father had said that, maybe I still would have felt angry. But Connor writing it was what made my heart sink. Because that meant he was not just standing on my father's side. He had seen the deepest weakness in me and quietly used it as a strategic argument. I did not cry. I did not feel shattered the way I had always imagined I would if the truth were ever fully exposed. I just became very calm. The kind of calm that comes after the last door has finally closed behind you. I took screenshots of the entire email chain. I saved them to an external hard drive, sent another copy to a different personal email account, then drove to a print shop before they closed. The pages slid out of the printer hot and straight, so white they felt almost cold in my hands. I bought a pack of plastic folders, a large envelope, and on the way home, I stopped at a drugstore to pick up a new USB drive. Every movement was neat, almost thoughtless. That night, I set the stack of documents beside my grandmother's letter, looked at the name written on the envelope for a long time, then picked up my phone. When the line started ringing, I found myself sitting up straighter, as if I were about to walk through a door from which there would be no turning back. Samuel Pierce's office. I took a slow breath, keeping my voice steady. "My name is Allison Harper," I said. "I think it's time we talked." The next morning, I arrived at Samuel Pierce's office almost 20 minutes before my appointment. The building sat on a quiet street near the historic district, with a dark brown brick front, a narrow glass door, and a brass plaque so small that if I had not known where to look, I might have walked right past it. Inside, it was cool and quiet, the smell of old wood, stored paper, and stale coffee blending into the kind of air that belongs only to places that have kept generations of secrets. The woman at the front desk only looked up to ask my name, then gave me the slightest smile, as if she had known this meeting would come. Samuel Pierce received me in a long office lined wall to wall with dark wooden file shelves. Light from the tall windows fell across a brown leather desk worn smooth along the edges, where countless hands had probably rested during conversations no third person was ever meant to hear. He stood when I entered, tall and lean, silver hair neatly combed, wearing a simple but carefully pressed gray suit. There was a steadiness about him that did not make you feel judged, only quietly required to be honest. "Thank you for coming, Allison," he said, his voice slow, clear, never overly formal. "Margaret believed you would call eventually." I set the envelope and the printed emails on the desk. "I think I've waited long enough." He sat down, put on his glasses, and read every page I gave him very carefully. There was no obvious look of surprise on his face when he saw the emails between my father and Connor. Only a pause, slightly longer than the rest, when he reached Connor's final line. Samuel took off his glasses, set them beside the papers, and looked at me with the eyes of someone who knew there are certain things that should not be said too soon. "Your grandmother was not wrong," he said. "And she was not vague." Then he opened the drawer on his right, took out a thick file tied with string, and set it in front of me. The cover was old, but carefully kept flat. On it was my grandmother's full legal name, Margaret Allison Harper. Just seeing her name printed so neatly on paper made my chest tighten for a beat. Samuel opened the file section by section, not rushing, as if he understood that some truths, delivered too quickly, become a shock, but delivered slowly enough, become something a person can actually absorb. He said my grandmother had been his client for 18 years. During the last 8 years of her life, after a conversation that he described as something that completely changed the way she prepared for the future, she had established an irrevocable trust. Not a simple will that could be interpreted however people pleased after her death, but a legal structure designed so that no one, not even family, could twist it according to emotion or personal interest. He placed in front of me a separate letter of explanation signed by my grandmother, along with medical records confirming her mental clarity at the time she signed it. Every page carried dates, notarization, the doctor's signature, and notes from the cognitive evaluation. I looked down at those dry, formal lines and still felt tears rising in my eyes. She had known people would question her. She had known it very clearly, and she had prepared in advance so no one could use her age as an excuse. "The most important part," Samuel said, his hand resting on the final page, "is that Margaret did not choose based on who was more successful, who made more money, or who looked more suitable in the eyes of other people. She wrote very clearly that she chose the person who understood what it means to keep a home alive with a soul." I did not say anything. I just sat there, my hands resting in my lap, as if I moved too suddenly, everything in front of me would disappear. Samuel slid the asset list toward me, an investment fund worth about $740,000, a historic beachfront house on Sullivan's Island. And then, the final line. The one that made me jerk my head up and look at him. The family estate, the house where my father was living, had never been entirely his. "I don't understand," I said quietly. Samuel nodded as if he had been expecting that exact question. He explained that the right to use and manage the house had been given to my father under very specific conditions, but the final ownership authority still remained in my grandmother's trust. In other words, my father had lived in that house for years with the confidence of an owner, when legally he had never actually held the full control he believed he had. I stared at the paper, and in my mind I saw my father sitting at the head of the dining table, in his private study, surrounded by the walls he had always used as an extension of his power. Suddenly, all of it meant something entirely different. Samuel was silent for a moment, then stood and walked to the filing cabinet behind him. When he returned, he set an old recording device on the desk, small and compact, its silver surface scratched with age. His voice was lower than before. "Margaret left an audio statement to be opened only in the event of a legal dispute or if the beneficiary needed confirmation of her intent." He pressed play. The first sound was a faint crackle, and then my grandmother's voice filled the room. Older, thinner than it was in my memory, but still carrying that particular steadiness she had never lost in her whole life. I heard myself inhale without realizing it. She spoke slowly, as if she knew every word would have to travel a long way before reaching the person who truly needed to hear it. She spoke about how families do not always know the difference between someone who is good at control and someone who truly knows how to care. Then, she paused for a brief second and said the sentence I still remember word for word. "My son mistakes authority for worth. I do not." I closed my eyes, not because I was surprised, but because for the first time in my life, someone in my family had spoken out loud the thing I had felt for so long but had never had proof to hold on to. She had not only loved me. She had seen through everything. She had seen my father's favoritism, my mother's silence, Connor's far too easy compliance, and even the part of me that had always tried to convince itself that maybe I was only being too sensitive. When the recording ended, the room was so quiet I could hear the clock in the outer office ticking. Samuel did not interrupt that silence. He let me sit with what I was feeling for a while longer before he finally spoke. Legally, he said, you have enough grounds to block any effort to change the beneficiary, and you could even raise the issue of abuse of fiduciary position if they have already started preparing formal filings. He looked down at the email exchanges between Connor and my father. Morally, this goes much deeper than that. I nodded, but by then, inside me, it was no longer just about winning or losing. It had moved somewhere else. Somewhere the pain was no longer about the money or the house, but about the fact that the only person who had ever truly seen my worth had needed to prepare all of this in advance, because she knew that once she was gone, the rest of the family would immediately try to rewrite the story in whatever way benefited them. Samuel tied the file closed again, placed both hands on the desk, and looked straight at me. "Do you want to handle this quietly?" he asked. "Or do you want the truth heard by the very people who laughed at you?" I did not need long to think. Maybe because some part of me had answered that question the moment my father smirked every time he talked about my work, or the moment Connor typed that cold line into his email. I looked at Samuel and heard my own voice come out calmer than I expected. "I want all of them in the room." I left Samuel Pierce's office with a strange feeling. Not exactly lighter, but no longer carrying the same fog that had been pressing on my chest for weeks. It felt more like standing in an old house after the last layer of wallpaper has finally been stripped away. What is underneath is not beautiful, but at least from that point on, you do not have to guess anymore. On the drive home, I did not turn on any music. I only listened to the sound of my tires rolling over the damp, late December road, and thought about what Samuel had said before I stood up. If you want, you still have time to choose silence. I had not answered him right then. But by the time I saw the Christmas lights hanging along the porches on the street, I knew I already had. I still went back to the house for the Christmas party, just like every year. The family house that night was glowing like a perfect postcard. The giant Christmas tree nearly touched the living room ceiling, covered in glass ornaments, deep red ribbons, and strands of warm golden lights. The piano in the corner stood open, with family photos in carefully polished silver frames resting on top. The red wine had already been opened, and the scents of cinnamon, butter, and roasted turkey blended together into the kind of holiday atmosphere that, from the doorway, would make no one imagine there was anything inside this house except prosperity and grace. My father greeted guests like the perfect host. Connor stood beside him, back straight, wine glass in hand, his expression carrying that exact mix of humility and confidence that belongs to someone who always knows he is standing exactly where he is expected to be. I walked in, kissed a few aunts on the cheek, took off my coat, handed over gifts the way I always did, and smiled just enough that no one asked any extra questions. Not one person in that room knew I had read the emails. Not one of them knew I had heard my grandmother's voice on that old recorder. And I realized that sometimes a person's greatest strength is not in saying what they know, but in staying silent long enough for everyone else to keep walking toward the edge on their own. By dinner, I had been seated at the smaller table beside the kitchen, with a few children and 2 aunts the family always treated like extra guests invited only to make the room look full, not like people who truly mattered. I looked at the main table draped in white linen beneath the chandelier, where my father sat at the head, Connor on his right, my mother on his left, and I saw that the arrangement was no different from a map of power that had existed in this house for years. I sat down in my chair, adjusted the napkin on my lap, and suddenly realized that I no longer hurt in the old way. There was only a very still, very clear coldness inside me. After the main course, my father lightly tapped the handle of his knife against his glass. The room quieted immediately, by the reflex he had trained into everyone for far too long. He stood, raised his wine glass, and smiled with the kind of warmth that had been carefully practiced. This year has been a year of many changes, he said. Our mother is gone, and that is a great loss for the whole family. But what gives me peace is knowing that this family still has someone strong enough to keep everything standing. He turned to Connor. Some sons are born for exactly that. A few soft laughs, a few approving nods. Connor lowered his head, his smile just humble enough to put people at ease. My father set down his glass, his hand opening slightly as if he were handing out recognition. Then he looked around the room, his voice slowing, growing deeper, as though he wanted every word to land exactly where it should. Some people inherit sentiment, he said. Some inherit responsibility. This time he looked straight at me. The whole room seemed to go silent in a single beat. Not exactly because everyone understood that the remark was aimed at me, but because everyone understood enough to know it was deliberate. My mother lowered her eyes to her plate. One of my aunts at the next table gently shifted her water glass. I saw Connor look at my father first, then turn to me. That moment alone made me understand that he knew exactly what my father was doing, and he was still letting it happen. I set my fork down. Not hard, not soft. Just enough for the sound of metal touching porcelain to ring out thin and clear in the silence. Did Grandma really say that? I did not raise my voice. I only asked, and because I asked so calmly, the air in the room froze at once. Connor turned sharply toward my father. My father's eyes changed slightly. It was not anger at first. First it was caution, then something sharper. He understood that I knew more than he wanted me to know. And because he could not control what I knew, he immediately chose to control me. What kind of attitude is that, Allison? His voice rang out, loud enough for both tables to hear clearly. Tonight is a night for family to be together. If you are not mature enough to behave properly, then you had better go upstairs to your room and stay there until morning. No one spoke up. No one told him to stop. No one said that I was 31 years old, not 13. Houses like mine always have their own special kind of silence. The kind built from so many years of endurance that people forget that endurance was always a choice, not an obligation. I thought that was humiliating enough. But my father was not done. He turned to my mother and held out his hand in front of everyone. Carol, keep her car keys. My mother looked up as if she could not believe what she had just heard. Daniel, keep the keys. You repeated it more sharply. Maybe Allison needs one night to remember that if you live in this house, you respect the rules of this house. I heard a few quiet laughs. Someone cleared their throat to hide the awkwardness. Some people avoided looking at me altogether because they did not want the feeling of having witnessed something wrong. I slipped my hand into my coat pocket and pulled out my keys. And the moment the metal touched my palm, I felt an old shame rise up like a bitter taste in my throat. Not because he was taking my car keys, but because he knew exactly how to humiliate me in front of other people. I placed the keys in my mother's hand. Her hand was cold and trembling slightly. All right, I said. My father thought that was a victory. I could see it in the way his shoulders lowered, in the short nod, in the satisfaction he barely bothered to hide. I stood up from the table, pushed my chair in, and walked upstairs between two rows of eyes that, a few months earlier, might have made me fight with everything I had not to break down halfway up the stairs. But that night, when I closed the bedroom door behind me, I did not cry. No one had actually locked the door. In that house, public humiliation had always been a stronger lock than any key. I sat on the edge of the bed for a few seconds, listening carefully to the beat of my own heart. Downstairs, the talking and laughter had already returned, muffled through the wooden floor and the walls, as if nothing had just happened at all. I opened my handbag, took out the small brass key my grandmother had left me, and held it in my palm for a moment, as if I were trying to warm something that had been asleep for too long. Then I stood, opened the bedroom door, stepped quietly into the hallway, and made my way toward the back staircase leading up to the attic. It was darker and colder up there than on the floors below. Old things covered in white sheets stood motionless in the thin light coming through the small window at the peak of the roof. I walked straight to my grandmother's dark leather suitcase, the one she had kept up there for years and never let anyone touch. I knelt down, slid the key into the small lock beside the handle. It fit so perfectly that a chill ran down my spine. A faint click sounded. Beneath the lining inside the suitcase was a hidden compartment. Inside it, there was only a thick, sealed envelope, with a line written on the front in my grandmother's familiar blue ink. For the moment they try to humiliate you in front of witnesses. I held that envelope for a long time before opening it. Not because I was afraid, but because I understood that my grandmother had never done anything on impulse. And if she had left me something meant for this exact moment, then what was inside could not possibly be only a few comforting words. At last I sat down on the freezing attic floor, rested the envelope on my knees and carefully slit the edge open. Inside was a short letter, a notarized copy of a legal addendum, and a business card with a phone number written by hand on the back. The letter was only a few paragraphs long, but every sentence felt written to straighten my spine at the exact moment I needed it most. She told me to leave the house before everyone woke up. She said that if Daniel had chosen to humiliate me in front of other people, then I could not give him one more scene he could call impulsive or disrespectful. Then, at the end of the letter, she wrote, "Let the truth enter the house through the front door, in the light of day." Beneath that was Samuel Pierce's name. When I finished reading it, I folded the letter, slipped the addendum and the business card into my handbag, and went back to my room. Downstairs, the laughter had started to fade. The house was settling into that heavy stillness of late midnight, when wine begins giving way to exhaustion, and everyone wants to believe that by morning everything will return to the old order. I changed clothes, packed only what I truly needed, and sat on the edge of the bed until almost 4 in the morning. I could not sleep, but I did not feel unraveled either. There was only one clear feeling inside me. I was no longer standing inside the story they had written for me. I left the house before daylight. I did not turn on any lights. I did not pull a suitcase. Just one large handbag, a camel coat, soft-soled shoes, and my car keys, which my mother had placed back on the small table in the hallway after everyone had gone to bed. I paused outside my grandmother's room for 1 second, my hand lightly touching the ice-cold doorknob, then kept walking. Outside, the December air cut across my skin like cold water. I got into the car, started the engine as quietly as I could, backed out of the driveway, and did not look back. I was not running away. I was only changing the battlefield. By around 7 o'clock, I was sitting in an early opening coffee shop about 20 minutes from the house. The glass windows were fogged over, and the smell of roasted coffee and warm cinnamon hung in the air so comfortably that it almost felt unfamiliar after a night like that. I chose a table by the window, ordered an Americano, and placed my handbag on the chair beside me, as if keeping it within sight was enough to keep my direction steady. At 10 minutes to 8, my phone vibrated. A message from Samuel. "I'm on my way. Stay where you are." Later, I learned that everything at the house unfolded almost exactly the way I had imagined. My father woke up a little later than usual, probably because he thought he had already won the night before. He went upstairs, knocked twice on my bedroom door, in that very particular way of his. Not a knock to ask, but a knock meant to make the person inside understand they were being summoned. When he heard no response, he opened the door himself. The bed had been made flat and neat. The closet was emptier than it needed to be. There was not a single thing left that suggested someone still lived in that room. "She ran off," he said as he came down the stairs, his voice flat and cold, as if it were not an observation but a verdict. I was not there to hear him say it, but I can picture his expression perfectly. That half smirk for a second. The relief of a man who believed the other person had just confirmed the weak role he had assigned them their entire life. I can also picture Connor looking up from his phone or his coffee cup, trying to keep his voice casual as he asked, "Where did she go?" while fully understanding that my father would see my disappearance as the final proof that I was not strong enough to stay in the same room with them. Then the doorbell rang. Samuel Pierce arrived exactly on time, like a man who had no intention of asking permission to step into a house that had always believed it never needed to explain itself to anyone. He was wearing a dark gray suit, a crisp white shirt collar, and carrying the same familiar leather briefcase. But this time, He was not arriving with only the quiet steadiness of an elderly lawyer. He came with the things that would no longer allow that house to stand on assumptions. The original trust, the medical records confirming my grandmother's sound mind, the printed emails between my father and Connor, and the certified copy of the addendum I had found the night before in the old suitcase. My mother opened the door. She froze for a second when she recognized him. "I need to speak with Mr. Daniel Harper," Samuel said. His voice was not loud, but it carried the firmness of a man who had not come for a social call. My father stepped out of the breakfast room right after that. "What are you doing here again?" Samuel looked straight at him. "To stop you from making one more mistake in front of too many witnesses." My father gave a dry laugh. "This is my house. You have no right to walk in here and start speaking to me like that." Samuel did not move. He simply opened his briefcase, took out a cream-colored file tied with string, and set it on the console table by the front door, as if that act alone was enough to change the temperature in the room. "You are still confusing possession with ownership, Daniel." I did not see that moment myself, but when Samuel told me about it later, I knew he had not said it as a challenge. He said it like he was reminding him of a truth so obvious that only the listener had spent years deliberately living outside it. And I understood why that sentence made my father so angry. Because he could tolerate being challenged, but he could not tolerate someone walking into the middle of his house and naming the illusion that had been holding him up for years. My father told him to leave. Connor stepped in, trying to calm the atmosphere with the polished corporate lawyer voice that worked so well in meetings where image risk had to be managed. My mother stood off to the side, her hands tightly clasped together, looking from my father to Samuel as if she knew that some door had just opened and no one would ever be able to close it the same way again. Samuel did not stay long. He did not need to spill the whole truth that morning. He only needed my father to understand that the truth was present now, standing right at the front door, and this time it had not come alone. Before leaving, he closed his briefcase, looked at my father one last time, and said very clearly, "At exactly 2 o'clock this afternoon, I will be present for the estate reading you arranged for yourself." He paused for a beat, as if he wanted to make sure no one in that house missed what came next. "And this time, Daniel, bring every relative you can. It will save time later." I looked at the clock on my phone just as it turned to 1:47. The coffee shop had thinned out since morning, and the winter sunlight was slanting through the glass in pale, narrow streaks across the wooden table. The coffee in front of me had gone cold a long time ago. I was still sitting there, both hands wrapped around the cup, as if the chill of the ceramic would help my mind stay at exactly the level of clarity I needed. Samuel arrived not long after. He did not ask whether I was ready, maybe because we both understood that for some things, readiness does not exist. There's only the moment when you have to walk in. We drove back to my family's house in silence. When we turned onto the familiar road leading to the front gate, I saw cars parked almost all along the curb. Clearly, my father had done exactly what he always did when he needed to reinforce his power. He built a setting large enough that no one would dare question that the final conclusion would belong to him. Through the tall living room windows, I could see rows of people packed closely together, yellow light falling over lowered heads, glasses of water resting on knees, the familiar waiting posture of relatives when they know something important is about to be announced. Daniel Harper stood in front of the fireplace as if it were a speaking platform built specifically for him. In his hand was a thin stack of papers, probably the distribution plan he had written himself. Connor sat near the front, back straight, one leg crossed over the other, one hand resting on the arm of the chair. His face holding its composure so carefully, it was almost expressionless. My mother sat off to one side, her hands folded together in her lap, her eyes dull like someone who had been awake too long and still could not wake up from a bad dream. When I stepped onto the front porch, Samuel was one step behind me. I was wearing the cream-colored coat my grandmother had once said made me look like someone who knows where she is going. I did not feel my legs shaking. Not because I was not afraid, but because by then, My fear had crossed some kind of line where it was no longer strong enough to pull me backward. I opened the door. The first sound I heard was my father's voice in the middle of a sentence. Then the sentence broke off as if someone had pulled the breath out of the room. Heads turned one after another. A few chairs gave off soft creaks against the wooden floor. Someone half stood and then sat back down. A child was gently pulled closer by an adult on instinct. The air changed so quickly, it almost felt touchable. My father looked at me, then at Samuel behind me. I could see the exact moment his eyes tightened. It was no longer surprise. It was something closer to anger mixed with panic, thin enough that no one else in the room had quite found the right name for it yet. "Oh," he said, trying to keep his voice even. "Allison decided to show up." I walked farther in, the sound of my heels against the wooden floor small and steady in the room that had gone still. I did not stay by the door. I walked straight to the center of the living room, where everyone could see me most clearly. Samuel stopped near the table beside the fireplace, set down his briefcase, but did not open it yet. For one strained second, no one spoke. Then my father glanced at Samuel's briefcase, and Connor broke first. "I was only trying to protect the family," he said, too quickly, as if the words had torn themselves out of him before he could stop them. They did not fall into the room like a sudden confession. They fell like the first crack in a sheet of glass that had been forced to bear too much pressure for too long. I heard a few soft breaths being drawn around me. One of my aunts in the back row let go of her water glass completely. Someone shifted in their chair, as if they had finally realized they were no longer sitting in a family meeting. But witnessing the moment, an entire old order was being turned upside down. My father turned toward Connor so quickly that his whole body almost jerked with it. "What are you saying?" he asked, but his voice was no longer as strong and steady as it had been before. There was a clear fracture in it now, the sound of a man still trying to hold his posture only because he had not yet accepted that he had lost control of the room several minutes earlier. Connor swallowed, his eyes fixed not on me but on the stack of papers on the table, as if by not looking directly at anyone, he could somehow avoid responsibility. "I was only doing what you asked me to do," he said. "You told me to draft an option in case." "In case what?" I cut in, my voice not loud but clear enough that no one could pretend not to hear it. "In case I kept believing my own family would never treat me like a stranger?" Connor looked up then, and for the first time that whole afternoon, I saw that the polished confidence he had carried for years was gone from his face. All that remained was something much uglier. The desperate rush to separate himself from the wreckage now coming into view. "You didn't write those emails alone, Connor," I continued. "Those lines describing me as unstable, too emotional, unfit for family assets. You suggested them, not Dad." "I was only using legal language," Connor replied. But the moment the words left his mouth, they sounded less like an explanation, and more like a desperate excuse. "That's how people present a filing." Samuel did not look at him. He only gently pushed the printed emails a little farther toward the rest of the room. "Legal language," he said, "does not require anyone to write. My sister still wants to be loved too much to fight back." No one spoke up to defend Connor. That was what changed everything. All my life, I had been used to my father and my brother saying something, and the room automatically leaning in that direction. But this time, my relatives were no longer looking at my father as the pillar of the family. They were looking at him the way people look at a wall that has just revealed damp rot behind the pretty paint. No one had to say it out loud. Just the way they stopped nodding, stopped lowering their eyes and avoiding the truth, was enough to turn him into a man standing in the middle of his own house with no audience left. Then my mother stood up. I heard the quiet scrape of her chair against the wooden floor. It was only a very small sound, but somehow it made the room even quieter than when my grandmother's recording had ended. My mother did not raise her voice. She did not step into the center of the room like someone coming to fight. She simply stood there, her hands hanging at her sides, her face still pale from a long day, and looked straight at my father. For years, I had grown so used to my mother's silence that sometimes even I forgot she once had a voice of her own. But when she spoke, I realized it was not that she had no voice. It was that she had hidden it for too long in a place none of us had been brave enough to reach. "You didn't protect this family," she said, slowly and very clearly. "You trained all of us to be afraid of you." I saw my father blink once, just once, as if he truly could not understand how the woman who had always sat quietly beside him at every dinner table, every holiday, every argument, could choose this moment in front of the whole family to say that out loud. But that was exactly why the words cut so deeply coming from my mother. If I had said them, he would have called it defiance. If Samuel had said them, he would have called it interference. But my mother was neither of those things. She was the person who had been beside him the longest, the one who had seen the most, and also the one who had stayed silent the longest. An aunt on my mother's side quietly lifted a hand to her mouth. Uncle Robert, who had sat silently by the window the entire time, slowly stood and moved to stand a little closer to me, without saying a word. It was only a small shift, but in families like mine, there are moments when a single step says more than a long speech ever could. Aunt June looked at me, her eyes red-rimmed, then said softly, "I'm sorry." Not long, not elaborate, but real enough to make my heart ache in a different way from the first pain. Connor looked around the room, as if he were searching for one face that was still on his side. But the people who had been sitting up so straight a few minutes earlier, listening to my father read his distribution plan, no longer wanted to meet his eyes. He looked down, picked up his coat from the back of the chair, the motion quick and stiff, then turned to my father. "I can't stay here any longer," he said, almost out of breath. "You deal with it." "Connor." My father said his name, and this time it was not to praise him or direct him. It was the sound of a man who had just realized the first thread tying him to his old position had snapped. But Connor did not stop. He walked past me without looking over, past my mother, past the table where the documents were still spread open, and straight out the front door. The sound of the door closing was not loud, but it had the finality of someone who knew he was leaving behind not just a confrontation, but the image of the family he had believed would always protect him. After that, my father turned back to me, and I realized he had changed tactics so quickly it was almost instinctive. When he could no longer overpower the room, he tried to shrink the confrontation down into a private matter between father and daughter, where he could recover his old advantage with a lower voice, with false intimacy, with all the long years of making me believe every wound had to be handled in silence. "Allison," he said, lowering his voice, "we need to talk privately." I saw a few people in the room glance at me, waiting to see whether I would step back into that familiar dark corner again. I looked straight at my father. I was no longer shaking. I no longer needed to choose my words carefully so I would not be called unreasonable. I let the silence hang for exactly one beat, long enough for him to understand that I was considering it, and then I answered in front of everyone. "You don't get privacy now. Not after making humiliation public." That sentence did not make the room explode. It made the room go even quieter, because everyone there remembered exactly what he had done to me the night before, in this same house, in front of this many witnesses. He had chosen the stage, he had chosen the audience, he had chosen to turn my dignity into a spectacle to reinforce his own power. And now what had come back to him was only a more honest version of the same principle. My father stood there for a few seconds, his hand opening and closing again at his side. I knew he was searching for some way to stand straighter, to pull his shoulders back, to keep speaking in the old voice. But he could not find it anymore, because once fear began to leave the room, he was no longer the center of power, only an older man standing among possessions he had mistaken for proof of his worth. No one stopped him when he turned and walked toward his study. No one called after him. No one asked him to explain himself. His steps were quicker than usual. Not exactly running away, but no longer carrying the ease of a man who believed he controlled everything. The door to his study slammed shut behind him, the sound sharp and hollow inside a house that had just undergone a change no piece of furniture could hide. And for the first time in my life, I did not see that as the retreat of a winner. I only saw a man who was finally forced to walk into the room he had once used as his throne. while outside that door, the whole family had just realized that the house had never truly belonged to him. The days that followed passed in a very different kind of silence. Not the suffocating kind in the old house, where everyone had to guess who was angry and why. This was the silence that comes after a collapse big enough, when the truth has been laid out across the table, and no one has the strength left to pretend they have not seen it. Samuel filed the petition to remove my father from the role of trustee at the very beginning of the next week. Connor came under ethical review for the legal language he had drafted and the filings he had helped prepare. Everything moved exactly the way Samuel had said it would, slowly, precisely, and without leaving much room for emotion to interfere. I signed papers, read files, answered emails, went to the bank, met with an appraiser, did all the ordinary things that, strangely enough, made me feel steadier. Maybe because for years I had lived with the feeling that I had to ask permission just to exist inside my own family's story. And now, for the first time, everything that carried my name was not mine, because someone pitied me, and not because someone had loosened their grip enough to let me keep a piece of it. It was mine because it had been mine from the beginning. The first thing I did was pay off the old debt. When I signed the final payment confirmation, I sat in my car for a few extra minutes, looking down at the paper in my hand and feeling my chest grow lighter in a way that was deeply practical. Not grand, not dramatic, just one burden finally set down. After that, I moved into the family house for a while. Not to live inside victory, but to do the thing my grandmother had known I would do. Open the windows, pull back the curtains, clear out the old smell, and make the house feel lived in again. Loved, not merely controlled. My father's study was the room I left for last. It had always carried the heavy smell of leather chairs, paperwork, and a cold kind of power clinging to every shelf. It took me 2 full days just to clear out the old files, wipe down the desk, and pull the leather chair away from the brightest corner. Then I brought in my drafting table, my books on architectural preservation, my wood samples, paint swatches, linen, and my own notebooks. When the first morning light fell through the window onto the new desk, I stood in the doorway looking in, and thought that maybe bringing a room back to life is a lot like bringing a person back to life. You do not have to deny the past. You just cannot let it keep deciding what the present is for. I kept the house on Sullivan's Island more intact. I went there on weekends when my heart grew too loud, opened the doors to let the sea air rush in, sat on the porch listening to the distant crash of the waves, and let time do the work no explanation ever could. One afternoon when I came back to the family house to look for a few of my grandmother's old things, I pulled open the small drawer in her bedroom and found a folded note caught in the far corner. The handwriting was still hers, the blue ink a little faded with time. I unfolded it. There was only one sentence on it. A house doesn't belong to the loudest person in it. It belongs to the one who knows how to keep love from leaving. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time with that note in my hand. Some things, if you hear them too early, you simply do not have enough life in you yet to understand them. And maybe she knew that. A few weeks later, my mother sent me a short letter. No longer than a greeting card, no explanation, no self-defense, just one single line: I should have chosen you sooner. I kept that letter in the kitchen drawer, beside my grandmother's note. Not to forget it, but to remember that some wounds do not have to disappear completely in order to be called healed. One early morning, when sunlight poured into the kitchen through the eastern window, I stood there alone, my hand resting on the old wooden counter that had been cleaned smooth, listening to the quiet of the house around me. And for the first time, that silence no longer made me draw into myself. It felt instead like a gentle open space that had finally agreed to let me walk into it. That was when I understood that what my grandmother had left me was not only money, houses, or ownership. She had left me proof that I had never been the extra piece in this family. It was only that some truths have to wait until everyone is in the room before they can ring out loudly enough that no one can deny them anymore. Maybe the thing that stays the longest after all of it is not the paperwork, or the house, or the money in the account. It is the feeling of finally being seen by one person, exactly as you truly are. If you have listened to me all the way to the end, thank you so much. And if stories like this touch some small corner of your heart, I hope you'll stay with me for the ones still to come. If you'd like, subscribe, and tell me where you're listening from. Or whether there was ever a moment in your own life when you had to stand up and protect your own worth.